This is Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerry-Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Massachusetts. And this is a podcast that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. On January 6, 2023, at Richneck Elementary School in Newport News, Virginia, a 6-year-old boy shot his teacher. The news reported that a school employee was notified of a possible firearm, and the young boy's bag had been searched prior to the shooting. The news reported that it may be difficult to claim that a 6-year-old is competent to stand trial, but that the state of Virginia does not have a statutory age limit. There was also concern that the juvenile justice system does not have detention facilities that are suitable for such a young child. At this time, the investigation is ongoing, and we do not have details about how the boy gained access to his mother's firearms. Today, I want to talk about the developmental capacity of a 6-year-old. And then, though specific details about the child and the family have not been released, I want to speculate about how race might intersect with incidents like this, particularly for Black children and Black families. So let's talk about 6-year-olds. And there are a lot of angles at which to look at this. One angle is that of a typically developing 6-year-old. The other angle would be that of a child who may have had some developmental stressors. But I'm going to start with talking about a typically developing 6-year-old. And this is not going to be a comprehensive review by any stretch of the imagination. I'm going to just briefly touch on infancy, which is age 0 to 2, because there are a lot of important things that happen during this time. Quality parental attachment, a predictable home environment, having basic needs met in a reasonable manner. Children in infancy start to develop a rudimentary sense of trust for adults. They begin to learn how to interact with the world in simple ways. Infants explore the world through their senses, and they start to take in patterns of how the world works. They start to develop a template for what to expect. Then from age 2 up until when kids first start school, they have trouble using logic or deductive reasoning to solve problems. I mean, have you ever tried to reason with a child in this age group? You can't do it. They don't use logic to come to conclusions in the same way that adults would. They have difficulty linking cause and effect, and they tend to be very prone to magical thinking. This is the age group where kids believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, several other magical things. They watch cartoons where the cartoon characters bounce back after being hit over the head, run over, shot, or otherwise injured. These cartoon characters bounce back in comical fashion. Once you get into that school age 6, 7, which is around the age of the child in this incident, you'll begin to start to see some emerging capacities that are inconsistent. You do start to see a bit of a drop off in the magical thinking. Around age 7 is often where kids start to realize Santa Claus isn't real and that sort of thing. And what's happening is that there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that is heavily involved with the thinking skills that kids and adults have. That part of the brain takes the longest to fully develop, even into your mid-20s. And this is why whenever children of any age are found guilty of a crime, there is a lot of debate about their capacity to fully understand what they have done. There's something called executive functioning that young children, like 6-year-olds, have a very low capacity for. Executive functioning involves problem solving. If you have a problem, how do you think through more than one possible solution and pick the best one? 6-year-olds can't do that without a lot of support. And even then, we tend to keep it really simple. Is it this one or that one? Pick from 2 options. So I would ask in this situation, when this child shot his teacher, What problem were they trying to solve with their 6-year-old level problem solving abilities? Executive functioning also includes understanding cause and effect, that if I do this, that this is going to happen. That capacity is very limited. 6-year-olds just don't have the capacity to broadly think outside of themselves, that larger picture of seeing the forest from the trees. Their brains can't do that. They have a limited and sometimes no capacity to be able to put themselves in someone else's shoes and understand how that other person might be thinking and feeling. This is an emerging capacity. So you may find a 6 or 7-year-old who sees another kid crying and asks, "Are you okay?" Because that ability to understand that that person is going through something that I'm not going through, that's an emerging capacity. It's so variable. It's weak, it's limited, and it's some kids kind of don't have that yet. And that's just typical development. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is typical emotional development. Again, we can only speculate since we don't have the details. But if someone harms another person, negative emotions are generally involved. So I want to briefly just talk about how we manage our emotions. Children start their life in infancy with zero capacity to regulate their emotional state. They initially rely entirely on their primary caregiver or caregivers to externally help them to get calm. They'll feed them, they'll soothe them, that sort of thing. Now, by the time you get to be 6 years old, you have an emerging capacity to manage your feelings, but you're still quite reliant on adults to help you problem solve how to manage negative emotional states like anger, sadness, and frustration. It's typical for children to become angry, but it's not typical for children to become extremely aggressive. Now, again, I don't know this child's history, so I'm not saying that they're aggressive. I'm just speaking in very, very general terms. The other thing to bear in mind for the 6-year-old that is now in school is that this may be the first time they're faced with peers that have differing abilities. So certain feelings can start to emerge, like inferiority and jealousy, even if in a simplistic and rudimentary way. This sense of fairness. This can vary so much at this age. So we don't know what this particular 6-year-old may have been thinking and feeling and what their capacity is. So the next thing I'm going to touch on briefly is morality. Morality. Did you know that our sense of morality develops in stages? Our capacity to understand right and wrong and the nuances of that develops over time. So according to the psychological theorist Jean Piaget, children in the 2 to 7 age group are pre-operational and they cannot really understand moral dilemmas. They do have a sense of good and bad, and they do understand the idea of punishment for doing something bad, but they understand rules very concretely. If you notice, school-age children are very much focused on fairness, but it's very simplistic, what's fair and what's not fair. Then I want to spend a moment talking about the quality of the relationship between children and adults, which is influenced by a psychological term called attachment. Attachment is a term that you've heard before. I mentioned it a bit earlier. Attachment behaviors are safety-seeking behaviors. Adults serve as a template of everything for children at this age. Adults are the source of safety when there's a potential threat. Attachment fosters trust. So usually, children are taught to see their teacher as a safe person. So what would have to happen for a school-age child to not trust their teacher? Well, as a child psychiatrist, I can tell you that there are reasons why a child might enter the school-age stage of development and have a lack of trust for adults or to not see them as safe. But I don't want to speculate too far into this case because the details aren't there. So if more details emerge in this case regarding the child's history, then at that time, maybe I'll consider doing a part 2 and talk a bit more about psychiatric conditions that can influence a child's behavior or cause them to diverge from typical development. Because there are certain psychological and psychiatric conditions that a child can have that could cause them to diverge from expected development. Now, as I said in the beginning, not very much has been released regarding the identities of the parent or child, but I want to enter into a thought exercise regarding what happens when a Black child or a Black parent is involved in the legal system. Number one, history shows that Black children tend to be perceived as older than their chronological age. And this means that the justice system tends to think of Black children as developmentally older than they are. So thinking about all of what I mentioned above about development, we know that Black children tend to be seen by the justice system as older and more capable. Number two, history shows that Black children tend to be perceived as more culpable than others. So if a group of children is misbehaving, a Black child tends to be seen as a ringleader. If something is missing, the Black child is assumed to have stolen it. Black children are assumed to be from rough neighborhoods, regardless of where they're actually from. When Black children do behave poorly, it is assumed that they're choosing to behave this way and need to be punished, rather than that there may be an underlying cause that should be addressed. Black children overall tend to be perceived as less innocent. They're seen as more responsible for their actions, while children of other backgrounds are seen as too young to be really responsible. Number three, history shows that Black children are typically more policed. They're watched more closely due to an assumption that they will lie, steal, use drugs, or disturb the peace. Number four, history shows that Black children and adults are handled with more severity by law authorities. Black children are perceived as more threatening and more dangerous, and therefore tend to elicit a stronger response from law officials who feel that they must use more force to keep things under control. All in all, your call to action is to support advocacy groups that fight for youth justice, particularly those that fight for youth of color to be treated fairly and in a developmentally appropriate manner. In this case, we have a 6-year-old who possibly can't even tie their shoelaces yet. And as my colleague said, this child likely cannot even read the phrase assault with a deadly weapon. I'm going to post an article from my colleague. Her name is Dr. Nancy Rappaport. She did a piece on school violence because she consults to schools regarding threat assessments. And in the article, she speaks about firearms in the home. But at this point, I want you listeners to think about this. A 6-year-old acquired a firearm from home and fatally shot a teacher. They're too young to fully understand what they did. Now, from a mental health perspective, let's think about this together. What will be the long-term mental health repercussions when this child is finally old enough to understand what happened? How will these potential feelings of regret, sadness, and guilt affect their wellness? When the irreversibility of the act becomes real to them. Also thinking about the family of the teacher who may be holding very complex emotions about or towards the child and the family. As a child psychiatrist, I can't help but think about the mental health implications of the incident for this child. If they eventually experience high levels of shame, guilt, and regret, as well as any kind of harsh punishment, they may be at risk for depression and suicidality. This child is at risk of trauma from the legal process. And will this child be at risk of being separated from their parent, their primary caregiver, particularly during a time of stress when they need their parent the most? And what are the implications for the child's mental health when they have a parent, a primary caregiver, that is under extreme stress? Wow, it's a lot to think about. But as I said, we don't have a lot of details specifically from this case. So this entire podcast episode is just a thought exercise. with the goal of providing information on child psychology and just sparking discussion about youth justice. So let me know your thoughts. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And that's it for the show today. Thanks for listening to Black Mental Health Matters. What would you like for me to talk about next time? Take care and have a great week.